Hello, and welcome to The People's AI, presented by Gensyn. I'm your host, Jeff Wilser, and today I'll be covering one of the most important topics in all of AI, how it should be regulated. What's good AI policy? What's bad AI policy? And who should be making that policy? What level, state, federal, global? We'll be covering all of that today in something of a debate, a respectful debate from two different perspectives. And I'm proud to partner with Gensyn to bring you season 2 of The People's AI. Gensyn is a protocol for machine learning computation. Gensyn is building the network for machine intelligence. That includes execution, communication, verification, and coordination software across every capable computer or device on the planet. And today, I am thrilled to welcome two very smart people to the show, each with a different take on AI policy. The first is Justin Hendrix, the CEO and editor-in-chief of Tech Policy Press. Justin thinks deeply about AI policy, and the risk of oversimplifying his stance, I think it's fair to say he feels that we need smart policy sooner rather than later, given the high stakes. Our other guest is Gensyn's very own COO, Jeff Amico. Jeff actually shares a good deal of common ground and common values with Justin, but he comes at this more from the lens of being pro-market and pro-open source, and a concern that overregulation could stifle innovation. I'd envision this as a debate, but it's not the kind of debate you see in politics with personal attacks, intellectually dishonest answers, or scoring cheap points. Both Justin and Jeff instead give thoughtful, measured, respectful responses, and I think this conversation will be of interest to anyone who cares about AI policy. Regardless of where you stand on the issue, I think there's value in hearing the other side, and Justin and Jeff each articulate that in a very lucid and respectful fashion. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Justin Hendrix, the CEO and editor-in-chief of Tech Policy Press, and Jeff Amico, the COO of Gensyn. Justin and Jeff, welcome to The People's AI.
Thanks for having us.
So super excited to dive into this really rich, complicated topic. As we said off mic, I'm sure we will solve all of these problems in the next 40, 50 minutes. I have no doubt. Before we launch into policy, I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of your backgrounds and what you're focused on now. Justin, start with you.
So I'm the CEO and editor of a site called Tech Policy Press, which focuses kind of on what you might imagine on technology policy. We look at specifically questions around tech at the intersection of democracy and society. So always interested in, how technology is helping us to build a more just, equitable, sustainable, democratic future.
And Jeff, yourself, sir.
For sure. So I'm Jeff Amico, the Chief Operating Officer at Gensyn. We're building a machine learning compute network. So it connects together any device around the world, everything from servers in data centers down to laptops you would have at home, aggregates that together and makes it available to startups, researchers, hobbyists who want to build new AI systems, train models, run inference, etc., but have struggled today accessing the compute that they need. So we view it as a way to expand access to this important technology and to make sure that it doesn't end up controlled by one or two companies.
So one reason that I wanted you both here is I think you both have a thoughtful but different perspective on policy and regulation. And this is a tricky topic. I think it's important to hear a range of voices and ideas. We'll get into the nuance in a bit, but I'd love to start with kind of a North Star of your view on AI policy and regulation. Justin, how would you describe your worldview and your North Star of AI policy and regulation?
Yeah, so Tech Policy Press, we publish a range of reporting, news analysis, and perspective on various topics in technology policy. So we don't necessarily advocate for any particular legislative outcome or political outcome, but we tend to look at technology through the lens that I mentioned before, which is, to what effect is it having on democracy, for instance? To what is it having an effect on society at large? How are we potentially kind of countering some of the problems that we see in society around, things like inequality or environmental sustainability or discrimination, various things of that nature. So when I tend to look at AI, I tend to look at technology more broadly. I'm asking questions through that lens.
Thanks, sir. And Jeff.
For sure. So I guess I come at this with a few key beliefs that animate a lot of my policy thinking. The first is that I'm fundamentally optimistic about this technology and believe that the benefits of it will far exceed the harms that come from it. I think we already see that today, to be honest, if you kind of compare these things side by side. If you look across domains, everything from medical research to drug discovery to education, and even, I think this ties into a lot of what Justin was saying. I think, we might disagree with how we get to those outcomes, but I actually think this technology does get us to a lot of those same places if it's harnessed in the right way. So one, I'm fundamentally optimistic about it. And then second is the main concern I do have, actually, and this might be something that Justin shares, is that it ends up being controlled by one or two big companies. I think this technology is transformative, but it's also one that we're coming increasingly reliant on, and I think that will only continue to grow into the future. I want to avoid a future state where we end up with OpenAI or Google owning all of the models, controlling all of the data that flows through it, being able to cut off access to people that they don't like. You could see how this extends out into a fairly dystopian future if we end up in that world. So a lot of my thinking is trying to avoid that outcome and make sure that we have the right market structure and incentives in place and policies in place such that we allow more companies, more startups to compete, so we don't end up in a world that looks like that. So that's kind of how I come at it. I do think there is definitely room for regulation. We could talk more about this later. I think it will likely, make more sense a bit later on, and certainly would make more sense at the application layer. So the actual usage of the technology for specific businesses, services, etc., as opposed to at the underlying kind of research and development into the models or the technology itself.
So I think we can all agree on the why this is important, and you both articulated that really well. I think there's I mean, there are a bazillion questions here. I think very broadly speaking, there's the who should be setting policy and regulating. There's the what we are regulating, and then Jeff alluded to the when. Let's start actually with the who, and that there's very recent. I mean, given the recent bill that passed the House, there are questions of kind of who should have the final say on AI rules. Is it Congress? Is it states? Is it some global body? None of the above. Jeff, let's start with you. What's your take on the who? Broadly speaking, and we can kind of dial it in a little deeper. Sure. Who is the most appropriate body in your minds to be creating these rules?
Yeah, sure. So again, I think it's a bit premature to jump to that question. I think right now we have existing laws in place that are not perfect, of course, but they do cover a lot of ground that can be used to basically litigate how these things should be handled. Things like consumer protection law, general tort liability, various other, just basic kind of anti-fraud, common law, doctrines that, you can use to apply to, companies that are using the technology in a bad way. And so what that looks like, in my view, initially is a lot of this stuff just gets worked through the court systems as it ordinarily would. So private litigation, in the event that there is some harm that is caused by the technology, a plaintiff can bring a case against, say, OpenAI for XYZ, and if it violates an existing law, that's a good place to start. Then over time, that gives us a sense of what the risks actually are, right? You don't want to jump into, kind of blanket regulate a space before you actually know what the what the risks are and what the
Right,
quantum of
right.
those risks are relative to the benefits.
Justin, what's your take on that, and who in your mind is kind of the ideal body to be tackling this?
Yeah, so I guess I would just say, if you zoom back out and you were to look down on the planet and say, what are those creatures down there doing about artificial intelligence policy and regulation? You would see activity at a variety of levels. You would see all kinds of flora and fauna across the ecosystem. You'd see international bodies that are convening. You'd see, national governments that have taken a stab at it. You'd see state governments. You'd see local governments, and of course, you'd see corporations, themselves organizing into various kind of self-governing bodies and entities. So there's just an enormous amount of activity on this front, and it's kind of hard to necessarily say who should get a say, who should not in any particular circumstance. I think their circumstances are different across the world when you look at what people expect of corporations, what people expect of cooperation between regulators and industry. And we just have a variety of different contexts. In the U.S., we appear to be, on the road to a fairly laissez-faire approach, as opposed to perhaps Europe, which is, got itself an AI Act in place, although even it appears to be essentially relaxing its posture on artificial intelligence at the moment, and thinking through whether it wants to enforce some of the code of practice and the various requirements that legislation has created. So, as far as ideal, I'm not, here to necessarily advocate for one particular government, having more power than another. But it does strike me that balance between state power and corporate power is what we should be thinking about. I'm skeptical of state power. I'm skeptical of corporate power. I'm very skeptical of the combination of the two things. And so that, to me, is one of the areas that I'm looking at when I think about regulatory regimes.
To get a little more specific, I'm guessing you guys might be on opposite sides of the federal bill. Can you, for listeners who are getting up to speed, Justin, kind of summarize for what was the bill to the kind of controversial bill, or maybe that's maybe that's a loaded word, but how would you describe the bill that was passed by the House and what this means for the states?
Yeah, and I will just say that I don't take a particular view on what the outcome should be in Congress on this issue, but I do have concerns about the language as it's put forward and the kind of sweeping effect that the aspect of the big beautiful bill, which was passed in May, to essentially potentially create a moratorium on state AI legislation. There are a lot of consequences of that. We can talk about those as we go through this. But I think there's an enormous amount of concern among civil society organizations, among tech accountability advocates, among among Republicans who are concerned about states' rights and concerned about the role of state governments in being able to protect their own citizens vis-a-vis the federal government. There's a lot of concern about the implications of this. And if you're somebody who covers tech policy, I think you look at this particular scenario and you have to look at this and say, this could potentially be one of the most impactful things that's happened on tech policy in the United States in possibly 30 years. It really could have a huge impact on the way that tech policy and tech accountability play out in the United States, certainly for at least a decade, but probably much longer.
And Jeff, what's your take, sir, on this bill?
So I think I am in favor of the idea that it would be bad if we ended up with a patchwork of 50 different state level frameworks that companies had to comply with. It's just unworkable when you're trying to, build a company, or you don't have the massive legal budget to, comply, or get licenses in every single state. So this kind of falls under the earlier idea I was talking about, where when you layer on regulation after regulation after regulation, what you're actually doing is implicitly biasing towards the big incumbent companies. And again, to me, I worry about us going further and further down that path. I think to me, that's the biggest concern I have with the technology, is that it does get co-opted by one or two, kind of profit motivated companies. And so the state level stuff, I think is concerning if what it would end up being is just, 50 different frameworks to comply with. In terms of the moratorium itself, you know, it could always be, let's say it does pass, it could still be reversed by a future act of Congress. So, in the event that politics change and we vote in a different composition of Congress 2 or 4 years from now, that's more reflective of the kind of people at that point, that could obviously change. And so I think of it like policy more generally. It's essentially dictated by the people's will, and that changes from time to time. That makes sense.
There are a ton of different levers that could be pulled as far as regulation. I think it's one reason why it's so tricky, right? What are we even talking about? Is it do we focus on, because we all want to avoid, I think, bad outcomes, right? No one wants terrorists to get easy access to building awful things. We want to avoid deep fake scams, misinformation. There are many things we want to avoid. We want to avoid discrimination, all these things. But there are so many different parts of the tech stack that could be at play here. Are we talking about the models themselves, the compute, the data, the finished products? Justin, how are you thinking about the various levers that could be pulled with respect to AI policy? What to you is most important that we really get right, and that where do you think is the smartest way for whoever to let's say we don't know, should be federal, global, state, let's put parking lot that. But now on the what, Justin, where do you see the smartest space that should be regulated?
Yeah, and this, again, a very difficult question. I would perhaps agree with Jeff that at the end of the day, the most important thing is that if we see a harm occurring in the world to an individual or a set of individuals or a group of a class of individuals, that we should have some recourse to address that harm. Mm-hmm. And so, there are a variety of means to do that. But certainly consumer protections and things like addressing fraud or unfair practices, algorithmic discrimination, things of that nature. We want to be able to do that. And, one could argue that there are certain provisions in federal law that should make it possible to do that in large part. And yet, across the country, in not just in technology, but in other domains as well, state law often provides a backstop to federal law. It often will essentially kind of even out some of that liability in a way that allows for states to introduce specific protections that may be relevant in their particular geography or particular political circumstances. So one of the concerns about the moratorium is that essentially it will kind of reduce the capability for people who want to seek some accountability to do that. The other kind of big thing is that, one of the big promises that folks have made around the moratorium is that, the goal should be to have a federal standard and should be to address some of these questions at the federal level. And I think there's many arguments that would potentially be made in that direction, even a progressive argument for a federal standard. But there's a kind of political reality, which is that Congress hasn't done much to advance tech regulation in the United States and does not appear set to. And even some of the basics simply aren't there when you look at the lack of privacy regulation, for instance. The rules of the road are simply just not clear, not set in the United States, even for the basics of being able to protect consumers from the worst potential abuses of artificial intelligence. So it's unclear to me precisely how a moratorium would help to address that.
Jeff, can I take a stab at doing my best to steelman what I think is your position with respect to that, and jump in, let me know if I have this right. Sure. That if we want to avoid bad outcomes, if we're not sure if the best approach is to say, okay, the model needs to look like this or can't look like that, or the compute should be only the X amount of compute should be used, or this type of compute should be used, or pick where you want the tech stack. You can go that route, but that risks being burdensome and restrictive for small projects trying to get ahead. So the route you prefer instead, especially because we don't really know what lever to pull, if bad things happen, then we use the court system to punish the bad actors. And because people might be punished by courts, they're incentivized to not have bad things happen. Is that warm? And if not, let me know where I'm off if that's not quite the right framework.
Yeah, I think that's most of it. That's where we start, right? I think the court system is almost the best kind of testing ground for what type of rules should later be created, because it actually susses out what the real harms have been as adjudicated by a real judge. And then we use that to create, laws and rules that make sense. I would actually, just as a counter to one of the points Justin made, I would actually point to some of the legislation that's moving through Congress right now for the blockchain and crypto space, to say that this stuff actually is possible for complex spaces. So, for folks who don't know, the Senate last week just passed a bill to regulate stablecoins, and I think most folks are of the belief that it's a good technology that promotes innovation, but there also are things that need to be regulated to make sure that actors are custodying things correctly, that there's transparency, et cetera. And so that's just maybe a good kind of counterexample for folks to keep in mind that actually this stuff is possible. It sometimes just takes a little while. In terms of what level of the stack it makes sense to actually regulate at, I would say it's higher up. So it is the kind of application of whatever the business is that you're using the underlying AI system for. So for example, let's say you are marketing your application. Let's say it's a therapist chatbot. And you're specifically holding yourself out as providing that service to users. To me, that's something where it actually would make sense to regulate that kind of activity in the same way that you would regulate therapists today. Mm-hmm. You could make the same kind of argument for other regulated industries, lawyers, for example, perhaps. If you're providing a service that has historically seen certain risks that it makes sense to mitigate through rules, I could see those same rules applying if you're providing that same kind of usage for end users.
Justin, what are you thinking when it comes to, we've been talking kind of a high level about the various levers. There are national security. I mean, there's part of what's tricky about this is there's so many different things that we're worried about, right? There's I'm just kind of popcorning a few ideas in no particular order. Human extinction is a risk. Bias models that lead to unfair outcomes for different communities, that's a risk. Jeff's point about therapists, application level harm, that's a risk. There's also geopolitical concerns. Justin, how are you thinking about let's kind of go the geopolitical national security angle now. How are you thinking about that with respect to AI policy, and what in your mind is appropriate to introduce given the geopolitics angle?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess just on this kind of general question of where is it right to regulate, where is it right to even an approach? We've seen so many different kind of attempts, shots on this goal. Folks kind of coming in saying, maybe we should look at compute, and everybody kind of trying to think about what compute thresholds are appropriate to put specific
Which
concerns
will change
around.
all the time, right? I mean, imagine that'd be very. I mean, that just feels like something that was designed to be obsolete in 72 hours, much less 72 months. That feels very
Yeah.
fraught.
I think that approach is sort of fallen out of favor more lately, and yet that also ties to some of the national security questions. Some of those AI safety questions. If you need to know about certain capability or certain computers that exist that have certain compute thresholds that may be beyond some threshold where you simply want to know that they're strategically important and that they're there. There's of course the data and thinking about regulating data, training data, curation, that part of it, and then the regulation of downstream behavior. I think we're going to talk about this a little later, but all these questions around open source versus closed source and the spectrum between those two extremes. But when it comes to national security, I mean, this is a topic that just really dominates on Capitol Hill in the U.S. at the moment. I listened to a lot of the hearings on artificial intelligence, and the amount of hand-wringing over the so-called race with China over artificial intelligence. How close are they? How close on our heels are they? Are they 3 weeks behind us, 3 months behind us? Are they already ahead? What will happen if China gets a super intelligent AI before the United States? All these concerns are expressed by lawmakers on a regular basis. And so, I think that is very much driving a lot of the kind of deregulatory environment in the United States, and certainly even abroad. I think that's a big piece of it, that people are more or less kind of buying into this idea that national security is in a severe circumstance if in fact we can't stay ahead. I would question some of those narratives. I think that there's good reason to question whether in fact the answer to U.S. national security or competitiveness is merely to take the shackles off industry and allow, in particular, some of the large companies that Jeff expressed concern about earlier to simply plod ahead with the full backing and little obstacle raised by the U.S. federal government.
Jeff, what's your take on that? Are you aligned on that, or do you have a different stance on the national security angle?
So I think it's a fallacy to assume that we could just cut off China, for example, from accessing this technology. I think that was kind of the flavor of the early, kind of attempts at regulating the stuff, and to some extent still is. And you even see it, by the way, with things like the export controls on chips. Um, it doesn't seem to be having any effect whatsoever. These Chinese companies are really smart. They're really competitive, and they find ways to deal with whatever kind of impediment you throw in their face. If you look at the DeepSeek models, for example, they were trained on much weaker hardware on account of the U.S. chip ban, but still got to the pretty much the exact same outcome as what the frontier models here in the U.S. were on a similar timeline. So I view those kind of things as ultimately being obsolete. It's almost a moot point to me. I think if you are concerned about that kind of stuff, and I think there are reasons to have concern about let's say a country like China having extremely powerful technology that exceeds what we have here in the U.S. or in the rest of the West. Then I think the way to actually solve that isn't to try to handicap them by saying you can't have these chips or we need to close source all the models, but instead it's actually to allow open source to proliferate, to allow the chips to get where they need to get to, so that you're not hurting a company like Nvidia, for example, and just allow this to be an actual competition, because that's what it's going to be in any event, in my opinion.
So you both mentioned open source. Let's go there now. I think that's one of the most fascinating questions out there. Is this inherent tension between the undeniable benefits of open source, yet it seems to me to be also undeniable risk. I think that there are fair arguments on both sides of this, that there's no question the overall ecosystem, much of it can benefit from open source. We've seen that time and time again in the tech world. Every listener knows that. It's also pretty easy to imagine a scenario where with open source, with especially, and we can get into what that means and what's open, how transparent our model weightings and so on, that bad actors can do very bad things with or as a result of that. I think it's a fascinating trade-off and tension. Justin, how would you characterize how you see that tension and what you would want to see with respect to kind of how quote unquote open we can let AI be?
Yeah, and I hate to be the person who's always answering it depends and it's complicated, and I'm not necessarily sure that one outcome is always better than the other one, et cetera. But I think this is another one where truly it depends. It's complicated. And because we have this binary in our mind of open, closed, that can kind of force us into thinking, yes, no, on a certain level. But we know that, as in a lot of technologies, open versus closed is not a binary. It's a spectrum. It's a gradient, if you will. There are a lot of distance between completely open and open weight models versus
I think it's a Keynesian scale openness, if you will. To make an analogy.
There you go. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that we've had a lot of debate on this on Tech Policy Press, over the potential dangers of open models versus closed ones, et cetera, and how to make the open models more secure and closed models, maybe more possible to scrutinize. So there seem to be just trade-offs, lots of trade-offs. And I think one of the other things that I just point out too, this goes back to one of Jeff's points around competition. I think there was a lot of early on sort of thought that we need openness to preserve competition, and if we have open source models, that will kind of keep it possible for everyone to compete. But we know that's not even necessarily true, right? Certain companies can pursue an open strategy in order to develop or maintain an advantage in the marketplace, and really put themselves in a very different position when it comes to competition. So I don't know. My mind is cluttered on this one. There's a lot of arguments and points to be.
I think that the it depends answer is completely fair in this context. Jeff, my understanding is you certainly lean more towards fostering open source development and encouraging open for competition. Let me know if I'm wrong on that. And
Yep.
Assuming that's the case, how are you thinking about mitigating the risks that are introduced in that kind of open environment?
Sure. So, yeah, I think just to really emphasize the first point there, and I'll just even give you a direct perspective on it from actually building a startup in this space. Without access to those open source models, startups like us just couldn't compete.
Yeah.
And so I'm talking about like the llama models, for example, from Meta. And now, by the way, there's a handful of really, really good models from Chinese companies, including Qwen from Alibaba, and the DeepSeek models as well. They're essential for startups to actually be able to experiment and to build stuff on. If we had to start from scratch and build our own frontier models every single time, it's just not. It just ends
Yeah.
up cutting off that pipeline. So that's a really key point that I experience every day. In terms of the risks that come from it, I actually view open source as fundamentally safer than closed source, in the sense that with closed source, you're essentially trusting one company to find all of the bugs, to find all of the risks, actually manage them correctly, and tell you the truth that they're managing them correctly and not just lie or obfuscate. As opposed to open source, you're basically shining sunlight on the entire system. Anyone can come in and find bugs. They can find ways to hack it. You see this, by the way, if you go back throughout history, systems like Linux, which are entirely open source, obviously, have become battle tested and hardened to the point now where nearly every single server inside of a data center runs on a Linux operating system, as opposed to a Microsoft one or something else. And so I think the same thing applies here. I would rather rely on the open ML community to find the risks with these things, to find solutions to them, rather than trusting, let's say, OpenAI to tell the truth about issues they're seeing, or even just to find the bugs. Right? There's something to be said about one company can only go so far, but if you open this up and people can build on it and use it, you're more likely to find issues with it just by virtue of expanding that scope of who's participating and who's hacking on it.
Justin, to your point about this not being binary, but more of a spectrum, is there a realistic middle ground you can envision kind of between fully open weights and like the lockdown APIs? And then I'm wondering, Jeff, if you would, and I appreciate the kind of startup mentality you bring to this, I'm wondering if there is a middle ground that would kind of ease your concerns in that front too.
Yeah, I'd be interested in Jeff's perspective as somebody who's worked with Llama in a live context, for instance. But I think technically we wouldn't call Llama completely open. It's not an entirely open model. They don't publish the weights as far as I'm aware. As far as middle ground, I don't know. I tend to think that I tend to favor open source as a rule, across technology and various types of technologies. I tend to see that perhaps has more of a kind of pro-democratic outcome than closed systems. But again, relating back to some of those other types of concerns that you were raising around national security and the rest, that's why this ends up being a kind of a particular consideration. And then back again to the kind of accountability question. If certain flaws or circumstances are baked into the foundation model that then others take and use, how do we hold those big developers to account? But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a perfect equilibrium. But this one does seem like one where, to some extent, it's more right to see how it plays out in the market.
Maybe just to jump in on that, because I think that's a key point, where with closed models, you don't really have any idea if you have baked in biases or if you have trained on certain types of data that are going to lead to bad outcomes or things like that. With open models, you can actually see, and even better if you have the data set that they were trained on as well, then you can really see, does this thing bake in all sorts of bad, biases or prejudices? If it's just a closed model, you're just accessing it through an API. You have no idea. And so you're always going to be reliant on whatever OpenAI decided to put into the model.
As we start to wind down, I'd love to kind of give you each a chance to express maybe your biggest concern with respect to future policy, and maybe that will help everyone understand both sides. And although it sounds like plenty of common ground as it is, but I'd love to hear kind of what troubles you the most from your perspective. Justin, let's start with you.
I think for me personally, again, I'll take that perspective of standing on the moon and looking down and wondering what those creatures are up to on the surface of that beautiful marble in the sky. And I think if you look down from that vantage right now, you see them building lots of concrete boxes all over the planet, and running, wires and enormous amounts of power into them. And you see them turning back on coal plants to power them. You see them pulling more and more rare earths and coal and carbon based material out of the planet in order to power them. And that concerns me. I think we're in a funny spot right now. We seem to be sacrificing whatever sliver of hope we had to reach our emissions and climate goals to an artificial intelligence boom that is speculative, and everyone's in, right? All the chips are getting pushed to the center of the table by government, by industry, and that concerns me. So I go to sleep at night worried about that. I worry about my children's future. I worry about the amount of conflict that we're seeing unfold across the world that have to do with resources and the movement of people and all of the rest of those things that will be exacerbated. And I can't separate those things in my mind from what we're seeing with regard to the expansion of a particular form of artificial intelligence
Let's
and a particular set of goals around it.
let's explore that a little further. And I'm glad you raised that issue. Again, I know there's no simple answer here. I know that it depends, but what type of policy would you think would most make sense to help mitigate the environmental impacts of AI development?
Well, I mean, just to tie this back somewhat to the conversation on the moratorium, there is some concern, for instance, that the moratorium could, in fact, kneecap the ability of states to even address some of these concerns around data centers. And there's been some reporting in Wired about some of those considerations, for instance. I think that we're seeing a spectrum of types of efforts around data center and the more industrial and infrastructure aspects of artificial intelligence. From, on the one hand, states and nations that are passing kind of incentives to attract data centers, build more data centers, on through to states and localities that are trying to control where they're built, how they're built, what resources go into them, the effect on the electrical grid, and even the extent to which individuals in a community may either benefit from tax revenues or have to pay as their electric bills go up, or suffer potentially issues if water or other resources are diverted to the data center that are scarce. So I don't know. For me, we're seeing it's just an enormous thing that's happening. Probably one of the biggest infrastructure projects that humanity has together endeavored on in decades, and it's happening extremely fast. We're talking about trillions of dollars that are forecast to be spent just in the next couple of 3 years.
Jeff, before we get to kind of your biggest concerns and area of focus, love to hear how you square your own optimism that you shared at the top of this conversation with those concerns about the environmental impacts and how you see the way forward on that.
Yeah, I'm really glad Justin brought that up. I think the energy footprint of this stuff is serious, and um, there's a great database that folks are interested called Epoch AI that has a stat that basically tracks the electricity that's required to train frontier models every single year over the last decade. And it's been increasing at a rate of 2x every single year. So you can tell what that curve looks like. It really animates a lot of our thinking as well at Jensen, and given what we're building, um, is really a partial solution to this issue. In our opinion, it provides a way to spread out the energy consumption across the world and to make better use of the compute that we have, rather than continuing to need to build these massive AI data centers in specific locations that draw massive amounts of power and require connectivity to the grid and all that kind of stuff in specific locations. So, I fundamentally agree. We come at it more from a market solution to that problem, but I do agree it's an issue overall. In terms of kind of zooming out to the broader question about concerns on the policy front, it's really what I was getting at earlier, that we end up layering regulation after regulation on top of companies who are trying to compete in this space. And in doing so, we end up shrinking and shrinking and shrinking the pool of companies who can actually participate, to the point where we end up in a future where all of the models that we use every day and depend on are run by OpenAI. and OpenAI only. So to me, that's the thing that it keeps me up at night, so to speak, that I very much want to avoid from a policy standpoint.
All right, we're not going to end this on a downer. So now I want you to each give a quick shot of hope, of what makes you hopeful. Why are you optimistic that we can get this right? Justin, do you have any, or if there's no hope, that's, I guess, a fair response also, but do you have any bits of optimism, Justin, of that we can conquer this problem?
Well, I think that as long as people are engaged on these issues and are willing to go out and be heard on these questions and recognize that even if they don't know, the difference between an open source model and a closed source model, or what a flop is, or any of these things, that they still should and can have a say in how artificial intelligence is developed. I was recently doing a little reporting on the Memphis XAI data center that is kind of a contentious issue in the community there. And I went out and took a look at the gas turbines that are kind of spewing fumes into a community called Boxtown in South Memphis. And I talked to activists there who are, making their voice heard on these questions. And, I think they have a positive vision for the world and for their community. And they want to try to negotiate that vision with what they see happening down the street, what this large company is doing and the impact of it on their community. And so to me, I don't know, that's kind of a parable of looking at the way that individuals can express themselves in a democracy and try to shape, better outcomes and the ways in which that intersects with industrial interests. I'm optimistic because people can still do that. Amazing.
Jeff, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm optimistic across the board on this technology. I think it has the potential to just generate massive progress for us as a human species, and I think I'm also optimistic that we can calibrate the regulations in a way that doesn't choke off competition and innovation, but also does mitigate the risks that do attain with it. So, again, I would actually point again to the legislation that's moving through Congress today in the blockchain space as a good analogy for this. It took far too long, probably, as I'm sure folks will agree, but it does show that there is a path to enabling a new important technology to grow and to prosper while imposing some common sense, safeguards and regulations around it. And we talked about examples of that. For me, that comes back to, if you're using the technology for a specific purpose and that purpose is regulated or it causes clear harm, then of course that should be, it's probably already illegal, to be honest, but if it's not for some reason, then that's where it makes sense to me to apply regulation. And I think we're going through this back and forth process, and I'm confident that we can find a good middle ground.
So if blockchain is any indication, by 2035, we'll have sensible AI regulation. No, but all kidding aside, guys, that was fantastic. I really appreciate the very measured, thoughtful opinions and insights from both of you. We avoided food fights. We avoided carnage. That was fantastic. Thanks again. Really enjoyed it. Appreciate you both.
Likewise. Thanks.
Thank you very much, both Jeffs.
Well, there you have it. Thanks again to Justin Hendrix, the CEO and editor-in-chief of Tech Policy Press, and to Jeff Amico, the CEO of Gensyn. Thank you again to my partner, Gensyn of Season 2. Gensyn is a protocol for machine learning computation. Gensyn is building the network for machine intelligence. That includes execution, communication, verification, and coordination software across every capable computer or device on the planet. Thank you to you, dear listener of the People's AI. If this is your first time here, please rate it 5 stars, subscribe on Apple or YouTube, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again. See you next time.